Some bonds form in darkness, when fear meets kindness and changes everything. On a winter morning, rancher Cole Danner finds a trembling baby donkey behind his barn, covered in soot and terror. Black smoke rises from a nearby illegal camp, and Cole realizes this creature escaped something horrible. Holding the donkey he names Ash. Painful memories surface, childhood trauma, animals he couldn't save. A brother lost in suspicious fire. What starts as rescue becomes deeper when Cole discovers the truth. The fire was deliberate, and Ash witnessed cruelty most ignore. Will one man's fight to protect this creature expose the corruption that nearly destroyed both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The soot on the donkey's fur told a story Cole Danner didn't want to read. But years of reading tracks and signs had taught him that ignoring evidence never made it disappear. He cradled the trembling creature against his worn flannel shirt, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his chest, a rhythm that matched his own racing pulse from 30 years ago, when he'd learned what it meant to hold something fragile in a world determined to break it. "Easy now, little one," Cole murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd once used to calm wounded soldiers in places whose names were still classified. "You're safe now." The donkey, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, pressed closer, its dark eyes wide with intelligence and terror. Cole had seen that look before, in mirrors and hospital beds, in the faces of men who'd witnessed things that hollowed out their sleep. He knew better than to make sudden movements or empty promises about everything being all right. Sometimes survival was enough to start with. His ranch stretched across 200 acres of Montana grassland, bordered by pine forests, and a creek that ran clear except during spring melt. Cole had bought the land 8 years ago with his army pension and disability settlement, seeking the kind of silence that only came with distance from civilization. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, lay 12 miles down a winding gravel road that became impassable during heavy snow. The isolation suited him. Most days, he carried the donkey toward the main barn, noting how it flinched at the sound of his boots on gravel, but didn't try to escape. Trust and resignation often looked similar from the outside, but Cole had learned to read the difference. This little one was choosing to trust, despite whatever had happened in that smoke on the horizon. Inside the barn, Cole's other rescues looked up with interest. There was Maggie, a one-eyed mare he'd found abandoned on the roadside 2 winters ago, and Chester, a goat with a limp who'd wandered onto his property during a thunderstorm and simply stayed. A barn cat named General, short for General Patton, emerged from the hayloft to investigate, tail twitching with curiosity rather than aggression. "We've got company," Cole announced to his small audience. He settled cross-legged in the center aisle, letting the donkey stand on its own, while remaining close enough to provide comfort. The animals gathered around in a loose circle, their presence somehow reassuring rather than overwhelming to the newcomer. Cole had always understood animals better than people. Animals didn't ask questions about the scars on his hands or why he sometimes woke up shouting at 3 in the morning. They didn't thank him for his service or look uncomfortable when he couldn't shake hands without flinching. They simply accepted care when it was offered and gave back what they could. The donkey took a tentative step toward Chester, who lowered his grizzled head in a gentle greeting. Cole watched the interaction with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read behavior under stress. Good signs? The trauma was fresh, but not complete. There was still capacity for connection. His cell phone buzzed, and Cole glanced at the caller ID before answering. Doc Miller, the local veterinarian, called every Monday morning to check on his animals and usually ended up staying for coffee and conversation that veered between livestock care and fishing reports. "Morning. Doc, Cole, I'm seeing smoke from the Peterson Place direction. Everything all right out there?" Doc Miller was 68 years old and had been treating animals in this county since before Cole was born. He drove a pickup truck held together by rust and determination, carried his veterinary supplies in a toolbox that had belonged to his father, and could diagnose a sick animal from 50 yards away. More importantly, he was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who'd never asked Cole about his time in the service. "Found a young donkey this morning," Cole said, watching as his new guest sniffed cautiously at Maggie's extended muzzle. "Covered in soot, scared half to death. That smoke you're seeing, there's been a fire. Lord have mercy. How's the little one doing? Physically seems okay. Emotionally?" Cole paused, running his free hand through graying hair that had once been regulation short and now curled slightly at his collar. "Well, you know how it is." Doc Miller did know. He'd treated enough of Cole's rescues to understand that physical healing often came easier than the other kind. "Want me to come take a look?" "If you have time. No rush, he's not in immediate danger. I'll be out after lunch. Zara Chen was asking about you at the cafe this morning, by the way. Wondered if you'd be coming to town any time soon." Cole felt the familiar warmth that always accompanied thoughts of Sarah. She'd moved to Cedar Falls 3 years ago to take over the Bluebird Cafe from her retiring aunt, bringing with her a master's degree in social work she never talked about, and a way of listening that made even the most taciturn ranchers open up over coffee and pie. She was 52 years old, had silver threading through her black hair, and possessed the kind of quiet strength that reminded Cole of his mother. "I'll probably head in later this week," Cole said. "Need supplies anyway." After ending the call, Cole spent the next hour in the barn, moving slowly and speaking softly, while his animals went about their morning routines. The donkey, he was already thinking of it as Ash, for reasons that went deeper than the soot, gradually relaxed enough to accept a handful of grain and a gentle touch along his neck. When the sun reached its midday height, Cole walked back to the house to prepare a proper meal. His home was a modest 2-bedroom log cabin that he'd renovated himself, adding a wraparound porch and reinforcing the foundation. The interior was sparse but comfortable, leather furniture chosen for durability rather than style. Bookshelves filled with military history and animal husbandry guides. A wood-burning stove that heated the entire space. In the bedroom, Cole opened the top drawer of his dresser and moved aside folded T-shirts to reveal a small wooden box. Inside lay his dog tags from his 22 years in the Army, first infantry, then special forces, finally military police. The metal felt warm from his touch, worn smooth at the edges from years of wearing them on missions that officially never happened. Dana. Cole James B., 12-15-1971, M. Episcopal. The tags had hung around his neck through 3 deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Distinguished Service Cross he kept in a safety deposit box in town, because looking at it reminded him of the men who hadn't come home. He'd taken them off the day he'd walked out of Walter Reed Medical Center, his left shoulder rebuilt with titanium pins and his sleep haunted by faces he couldn't save. Cole returned the box to its place beneath his shirts. Some things were better left buried, but never forgotten. Back in the barn, he found Ash lying in the straw beside Chester, both animals resting in the afternoon sun that streamed through the open doors. The donkey lifted his head when Cole approached, but didn't move away. "Progress. Doc Miller's coming to see you later," Cole said, settling onto a hay bale. "He's good people. Helped all these folks when they needed it most." Maggie wandered over and nuzzled Cole's shoulder, a gesture of affection that still caught him off guard after 2 years. Before the ranch, before the animals, Cole had gone months without physical contact beyond handshakes and medical examinations. The casual intimacy of animal companionship had been a revelation. Comfort without complexity, loyalty without conditions. His phone buzzed again. "Sheriff Hawkins this time. Cole, got a report about smoke from your direction." "Everything all right?" Sheriff Ray Hawkins was a decent man caught between doing his job and keeping peace with the people who paid his salary. He'd been elected on a platform of maintaining order and tradition, which in Cedar Falls meant not asking too many questions about certain business practices. Cole respected the position even when he disagreed with the choices. "Fire wasn't on my property," Cole said carefully. "Found a donkey that escaped from somewhere in that direction. Animal's safe, but somebody might want to check what happened over there." A pause. Well, I appreciate you letting me know. Long as everyone's safe. The conversation ended with the kind of polite finality that meant the subject was closed. Cole set down his phone and looked at Ash, who was watching him with those two intelligent eyes. "Looks like it's just us for now, little one," he said. "But sometimes that's enough." The afternoon stretched into evening, and Cole maintained his vigil in the barn. He'd learned patience in the army, the kind that kept you alive when rushing forward meant walking into an ambush. He'd learned it again during months of rehabilitation, when healing measured itself in millimeters of movement and degrees of rotation. Now he applied it to wounded animals, understanding that trust couldn't be forced, only offered and accepted. When Doc Miller's truck rattled up the drive, Ash lifted his head but didn't panic. Cole took that as another good sign. "Well, I'll be," Doc said, climbing out of his truck with the careful movements of a man whose knees had seen too many years of climbing in and out of barns. "Haven't seen a donkey this young in the county since—" He stopped, frowning. "Actually, can't recall seeing one at all recently." "Where'd you say you found him?" Cole described the morning's discovery, while Doc Miller examined Ash with gentle, experienced hands. The donkey submitted to the examination with remarkable calm, as if understanding that these humans meant help rather than harm. "He's in good condition physically," Doc reported. "Little underweight, some stress signs, but nothing time and good care won't fix." "You're right about the emotional trauma, though. This little fellow has seen some hard times." They stood together in the barn aisle, two men who'd learned to read suffering in different contexts but with similar skills. "Ray Hawkins called you yet?" Doc asked briefly. "Got the impression the fire wasn't his priority." Doc nodded slowly. "Ray's a good man, but he's got pressures. Some folks in this county prefer their business stays private, if you know what I mean." Cole knew. Every small community had its secrets, its arrangements that existed outside official channels. Usually he was content to mind his own business and let others do the same. But something about Ash's presence, about the terror in those dark eyes, reminded him of other times when looking the other way had cost more than getting involved. "Donkeys staying," Cole said simply. "Figured as much." Doc Miller smiled. "Sarah Chen's going to love hearing about this. She's got a soft spot for your rescue stories." After Doc left, Cole spent the evening hours in the barn with his animals. This had become his routine over the years, a time of quiet reflection when the day's work was done and the night's peace hadn't yet been broken by memories. He'd brought a cup of coffee and a thermos to refill it. Planning to stay until Ash seemed settled enough for sleep, the donkey had claimed a spot near the back wall, where he could see both entrances but felt protected from behind. Smart positioning, the kind of tactical awareness that spoke to intelligence shaped by necessity. Cole understood that impulse completely. As darkness settled over the ranch, Cole found his thoughts drifting to the smoke he'd seen that morning, to the fear in Ash's eyes, to the careful neutrality in Sheriff Hawkins' voice. Sometimes the right thing to do wasn't clear until you were already doing it, and by then the choice was behind you rather than ahead. He looked at Ash, who was watching him with decreasing wariness, and made a decision that felt as inevitable as sunrise. "We'll figure this out together," he promised quietly. "Whatever happened to you, whoever did it, they don't get to win." Ash lowered his head to the straw, and for the first time since morning, his breathing settled into the slower rhythm of rest rather than vigilance. Cole took it as acceptance of his promise and a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. But ready or not, some commitments chose you rather than the other way around. Cole Danner had learned that lesson many times before, in places far from Montana, and the learning had cost him more than he'd ever planned to pay. This time, though maybe the price would be worth it, Cole woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 8 years. Military habits died hard, and some, like the ability to function on 4 hours of sleep and wake without an alarm, had served him well in civilian life. He dressed quietly in the darkness, pulling on work clothes that smelled of hay and honest labor, then made his way to the barn to check on Ash. The donkey was awake, standing alert but calm in his makeshift stall. His dark eyes tracked Cole's movement without panic, progress that would have taken weeks with some animals. There was an intelligence there that went beyond simple survival instinct, a quality Cole recognized from working with military working dogs, who'd learned to read human intentions with life-or-death accuracy. "Morning, little one," Cole said softly, offering a handful of grain. Ash accepted it cautiously, his soft muzzle brushing against Cole's palm. "Ready to take a look at where you came from?" After feeding his animals and loading supplies into his truck, Cole secured Ash in a travel carrier he'd borrowed from Doc Miller. The donkey protested initially, but settled once the truck began moving, perhaps understanding that forward motion meant progress rather than return to danger. The drive toward the smoke took them down county roads that wound through patches of scrubland and abandoned homesteads. This part of Montana held the bones of failed dreams. Farms that couldn't survive drought years, ranches broken by economic downturns, properties that changed hands regularly as people chased promises that never materialized. The smell reached them before they saw the source, acrid smoke mixed with something organic and wrong. Cole had encountered similar odors during his deployments, the aftermath of fire that had consumed more than buildings. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as muscle memory activated responses he'd thought were buried. Around a bend in the road, the devastation came into view. What had once been a ramshackle compound of trailers and makeshift pens was now a blackened scar on the landscape. The metal frame of a large barn stood like a skeleton, twisted support beams reaching towards sky, still hazed with drifting smoke. Scattered around the perimeter lay the remains of fencing, feed containers, and equipment that spoke to a large-scale operation hastily abandoned. Cole parked well back from the scene and studied it with the systematic approach he'd learned in reconnaissance training. No emergency vehicles, no investigation tape, no signs that authorities had been here at all. The fire had burned hot and fast, consuming wooden structures completely, while leaving metal debris scattered like evidence waiting to be read. In the carrier behind him, Ash began making soft distress sounds, not panic but recognition. This was definitely where he'd come from. Cole left the donkey in the truck and approached the scene on foot, his boots crunching on debris that ranged from charred wood to melted plastic. The scope of the operation became clear as he moved through the ruins. This had been a livestock facility capable of holding dozens of animals, with loading chutes that suggested regular transport, feed storage that indicated a commercial-scale operation, and it had all been completely illegal. No permits would have been issued for this kind of facility in this location. No health inspections, no environmental oversight, no animal welfare checks. The kind of operation that existed in the gaps between official attention, serving purposes that couldn't survive daylight scrutiny. Near what had been the main barn, Cole found his first piece of concrete evidence. A partially melted feed bag with enough lettering intact to read, "Premium Livestock Growth Supplement, not for human consumption." The manufacturer's name was visible too, a company Cole had never heard of, which likely meant it specialized in products that skirted FDA approval. He photographed the bag with his phone, then continued his survey. In a metal container that had survived the fire, he discovered syringes, vials of unidentified chemicals, and documentation that made his stomach turn. Records of livestock purchases, transport schedules, and customer lists that read like a catalogue of exploitation. This hadn't been a rescue operation or even a legitimate breeding facility. The evidence pointed to something much darker. Animals kept in conditions designed to maximize profit while minimizing oversight, subjected to treatment that would have resulted in immediate shutdown if discovered by authorities. The kind of operation that survived through isolation and the cooperation of people who preferred not to ask questions. Cole heard vehicle. Engines approaching and quickly pocketed several pieces of evidence before walking back toward his truck. Two vehicles came into view. Sheriff Hawkins in his patrol car, followed by a black SUV with tinted windows that spoke of money and the kind of influence that money bought. "Cole!" Sheriff Hawkins called out as he climbed from his patrol car. Didn't expect to see you out here." The sheriff looked tired, older than his 55 years, with the kind of weariness that came from compromises that accumulated over time. Behind him, two men in expensive casual clothes emerged from the SUV, the kind of people who manage dirty business while keeping their own hands clean. "Found this donkey yesterday morning," Cole said, gesturing toward his truck where ash was visible through the carrier's mesh door. "Figured I should see where he came from." One of the men from the SUV stepped forward, tall, silver-haired, wearing boots that had never seen actual ranch work. Everything about him suggested authority accustomed to deference. "I'm Marcus Webb," the man said, extending a hand that Cole ignored. "I own several properties in this area, including this one. Appreciate your concern for the animal, but we can handle things from here." Cole studied Webb with the same attention he'd once given to potential threats in hostile territory. Expensive watch, manicured nails, the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no from people who mattered. Also, the telltale tension around his eyes that suggested he was working harder to project calm than the situation should require. "Interesting timing," Cole said mildly. "Fire happens. Investigation starts the next day." "No investigation necessary," Webb replied smoothly. "Electrical fire already confirmed. Insurance will handle the cleanup." Sheriff Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Cole, like Mr. Webb says, everything's under control here. Appreciate you bringing the donkey back, but I'm not bringing him back," Cole interrupted. "I'm keeping him." The silence stretched for several seconds. Webb's expression hardened slightly, revealing something beneath the polished surface that reminded Cole of officers he'd known who confused authority with power. "That's stolen property," Webb said. "Prove it." Cole's voice carried the same quiet authority he'd used with hostile interrogation subjects, calm, reasonable, and absolutely unmovable. "Show me purchase records, registration papers, anything that proves ownership." Webb's jaw tightened. "I don't have to prove anything to you." "Then you don't own him." Cole turned toward his truck. "Ray, unless you got a warrant or some actual evidence of theft, I'll be heading home now." Sheriff Hawkins looked between Cole and Webb, clearly caught between conflicting pressures. "Cole, maybe we could work something out." "Nothing to work out," Cole said, climbing into his truck. "Found an abandoned animal, gave it shelter. That's legal in this state, last I checked." As he drove away, Cole watched in his rearview mirror as Webb gestured angrily while speaking to the sheriff. Whatever conversation was happening, it wasn't friendly. And it wasn't about electrical fires or insurance claims. Back at the ranch, Cole carried Ash to the barn and settled him in the same stall where he'd spent the previous night. The donkey seemed calmer now, as if understanding that distance from the burned facility meant safety rather than temporary reprieve. "You saw things, didn't you?" Cole said quietly, stroking the animal's neck. "Bad things that people wanted to keep hidden." Ash leaned into the touch, a gesture of trust that carried more weight than most human promises Cole had received. Over the next hour, Cole uploaded the photos from the burned facility to his laptop and began researching the companies and names he'd found in the debris. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. A network of operations that existed in legal gray areas, serving customers who valued profits over animal welfare, connected through shell companies and intermediaries that made accountability nearly impossible. Marcus Webb's name appeared in property records going back 15 years, always as a silent partner or secondary investor, never directly connected to the operation themselves, but somehow involved in their financing and logistics. Cole's phone rang. "Sarah Chen's number. Hey, stranger. Doc Miller mentioned you found a donkey yesterday. How's the little guy doing?" Sarah's voice carried warmth that seemed to reach through the phone and settle the tension in his shoulders. He found himself smiling despite the morning's discoveries, better than expected. "Smart little fellow, adapts quickly. I'd love to meet him sometime, if that's all right. I've got experience with trauma recovery, though usually with people rather than animals." Cole had always wondered about Sarah's background, the way she seemed to understand complicated situations without asking intrusive questions. A master's degree in social work suggested professional experience with damaged lives and difficult healing. "You're welcome any time," he said. "Fair warning, though, might be some complications ahead. The kind that involve certain people wanting their business left private." Cole paused. Sarah's insight consistently surprised him. Her ability to read between lines and understand implications that others missed or chose to ignore. That kind exactly. "Well," Sarah said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Good thing you're not the type to back down from complications." After ending the call, Cole spent the afternoon reinforcing his barn security and checking his property perimeter. Old habits activated by new threats. He'd chosen this isolated location partially for its defensibility, though he'd hoped never to need that advantage. As evening approached, he sat in the barn with Ash and his other animals, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. The donkey had claimed a spot near the door, where he could see outside while remaining protected, a choice that spoke to instincts shaped by experience rather than breeding. "Tomorrow we start fighting back," Cole said quietly. "Not the way they expect, but the way that works." Ash lifted his head and looked at Cole with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding that their partnership had evolved beyond simple rescue and shelter. In his pocket, the partially melted feed bag felt like evidence and promise combined, proof of crimes that demanded justice, and the beginning of a commitment that would test everything Cole had learned about choosing battles worth fighting. Outside, darkness settled over the ranch, but for the first time in years, Cole felt completely awake. The morning after his confrontation with Marcus Webb, Cole woke with the familiar weight of decision settling in his chest. The same feeling he'd carried before missions, where the margin for error was measured in lives rather than dollars. He dressed in the pre-dawn darkness and made his way to the barn, where Ash waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant staying very still. "Time to make this official," Cole murmured, offering the donkey a handful of grain. "You're not going anywhere, and neither am I." The barn had 3 additional stalls that Cole had never used, having built them with the optimistic belief that he might eventually acquire more horses. Now he spent the morning converting one into proper accommodations for a donkey, reinforcing the door, adjusting the water system, and installing a warming lamp for the coming winter months, while measuring lumber for a feed station. Cole's hand brushed against something wedged behind a support beam. He pulled out a child's baseball glove, cracked leather darkened with age and neglect. The name Tommy was still visible, written in fading blue marker across the palm. Cole sat heavily on a hay bale, the glove cradled in his hands like something that might dissolve if handled roughly. Tommy's glove. 8 years of living on this ranch, and he'd never found it. Never known it was here, waiting in the shadows. The memories came without invitation, carrying the weight of 35 years. Tommy at age 7, serious and determined, spending hours throwing a tennis ball against the barn wall because their father was too tired after 16-hour days to play catch. Tommy practicing his swing with a broken bat held together by electrical tape, dreaming of playing high school baseball even though their small farm barely produced enough income to keep them fed. Tommy had hidden the glove here the night before the fire, Cole realized. Hidden it the way children hide treasures they're afraid of losing. Except this time the fear had been prophetic. "You remembering too, aren't you?" Cole said to Ash, who had wandered over to investigate. "Remembering things you wish you could forget." The donkey lowered his head, and Cole found himself stroking the soft fur between Ash's ears while clutching his brother's glove with his other hand. 2 survivors separated by decades and species, connected by the understanding that some losses never healed completely. They just learned to carry them differently. Doc Miller's truck rattled up the drive around 10 o'clock, interrupting Cole's work on the new stall. The veterinarian climbed out with his usual careful movements, carrying a leather bag that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. "Thought I'd check on our patient," Doc said, but his eyes lingered on Cole's face with professional concern. "You look like you've been wrestling with ghosts." Cole held up Tommy's glove. "Found this while working on Ash's stall. Haven't seen it since I was 12 years old." Doc Miller nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd lived through enough history to recognize the weight of unexpected memories. Funny how the past keeps turning up when you're trying to move forward. They worked together in comfortable silence, Doc examining Ash while Cole finished installing the feed station. The donkey submitted to the medical check with increasing trust, allowing Doc to handle his hooves and examine his teeth without resistance. "He's gaining weight already," Doc reported. "Stress levels decreasing too. You've got a gift for this, Cole, just giving him what he needs, which is more than most people understand." Doc packed his equipment with practiced efficiency. "Speaking of which, had an interesting visitor at my clinic this morning." Cole looked up from adjusting the stall door latch. "Webb?" "One of his associates. Fellow named Patterson. Drives that black SUV you probably saw yesterday. Asked if I'd examined any animals from the Peterson property fire. Wondered if there might be health concerns for livestock in the area." "What'd you tell him?" "That I examine animals brought to my clinic by their legal owners." Doc's smile carried sharp edges. Seemed to frustrate him considerably. Cole finished securing the latch and tested it twice, old habits from securing equipment that couldn't afford to fail. "Webb's moving fast. That suggests he's worried about something. Or someone." Doc leaned against the stall door, his weathered hands folded over the top rail. "Cole, I've been practicing veterinary medicine in this county for 40 years. Seen a lot of arrangements that exist because people find it easier to look the other way than ask hard questions. But there's looking the other way, and there's being complicit in cruelty. That facility you found, what was left of it, that wasn't just cutting corners on regulations. That was something uglier." Cole had suspected as much from the evidence he'd collected, but hearing it confirmed by someone with Doc Miller's experience carried additional weight. "How ugly?" "The kind that keeps veterinarians from sleeping well at night." Doc's expression hardened. "The kind that makes decent people wonder if they should have spoken up sooner." After Doc left, Cole spent the afternoon making calls to county offices, trying to trace the history of the burned property through official channels. The results were frustrating but informative. Ownership records that changed hands frequently, permits that were applied for but never approved, complaints that were filed but never investigated, a pattern of bureaucratic indifference that suggested either incompetence or intentional blindness. His research was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, plural. Cole walked to the front porch and counted 4 trucks coming up his drive, moving with the casual confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through numbers and intimidation. He recognized Marcus Webb in the lead vehicle, accompanied by the same associate Doc Miller had mentioned. The other trucks carried men who looked like they earned their living with their hands, but took orders from people who didn't. Cole waited on his porch, hands visible and relaxed, while his visitors arranged themselves in a loose semicircle that was probably meant to seem casual rather than threatening. Military experience had taught him to read tactical positioning. And this was definitely tactical, Mr. Danner, Webb said, climbing from his truck with the kind of careful movements that suggested awareness of being watched. "Hoped we could resolve our misunderstanding in a neighborly way." "No misunderstanding," Cole replied mildly. "I found an abandoned animal and gave it shelter. Pretty straightforward. The thing is, that animal represents a significant investment. Specialized breeding, expensive care, genetic value that runs into thousands of dollars." Cole almost smiled at the transparent lie. Ash was clearly a mixed-breed donkey, probably worth less than $500 under the best circumstances. But Webb was counting on intimidation to substitute for logic. "Show me the papers," Cole said. "Registration, purchase records, veterinary documentation. Prove ownership and we can talk." Webb's jaw tightened. "I don't carry paperwork for every animal on every property I own." "Then I guess you don't own him." The men beside Webb shifted slightly, a subtle realignment that spoke to experience with conflict resolution through physical means. Cole read the change without appearing to notice, his own posture remaining relaxed while his awareness shifted to tactical alert. Mr. Danner, Webb said, his voice dropping into a register that was probably meant to convey menace. You're new to this county. Maybe you don't understand how things work here. The relationships that keep everyone prosperous and happy. I understand perfectly. Cole's voice remained conversational. I understand that some people think isolation means immunity from consequences. I understand that some operations survive by convincing authorities to look the other way. And I understand that some folks mistake temporary advantage for permanent power. The silence stretched for several seconds. Webb's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and finally, something that looked like genuine anger. You're making a mistake, Webb said. Wouldn't be the first time. Cole smiled without warmth. But I've gotten pretty good at learning from them. After Webb and his entourage left, Cole walked to the barn and found Ash standing alert in his new stall, ears pricked forward as if he'd been listening to the entire conversation. The donkey's intelligence continued to surprise him, not just animal awareness, but something approaching comprehension of human dynamics and their implications. Looks like we're officially in this together, Cole said, settling onto a hay bale with Tommy's glove still in his hands. Fair warning. I'm not always the easiest person to be partners with. Ash approached the stall door and extended his muzzle toward the glove, sniffing with the careful attention animals gave to objects carrying emotional weight. Then he looked directly at Cole with those dark, intelligent eyes, and something passed between them that felt like mutual recognition. Two survivors who'd lost more than they'd ever planned to lose, choosing to trust each other because the alternative was facing the darkness alone. Cole carefully placed Tommy's glove on a shelf where he could see it while working in the barn. Some memories deserve to be visible, to serve as reminders of what happened when good people looked the other way while bad things occurred. Tomorrow we start asking the right questions, he told Ash, and we keep asking until we get answers that make sense. Outside, evening settled over the ranch with the deceptive peace that often preceded the kind of storms that changed landscapes permanently. Cole had lived through enough such storms to recognize the signs, and this time he intended to be ready. Cole found the note wedged under his front door when he stepped out for morning chores, a folded piece of plain paper that had been placed with the kind of stealth that spoke to familiarity with his routines. The message was brief and direct, printed in block letters that revealed nothing about the author's identity. Mind your own business or face the consequences. The donkey isn't worth the trouble it will bring you. He studied the paper with the systematic attention he'd once given to intelligence briefings, noting the quality of the stock, the printer ink, the careful anonymity that suggested someone with experience in avoiding identification. Professional threatening letters, if such a thing existed. In the barn, Ash looked up from his breakfast with the kind of alertness that suggested he'd heard the approaching footsteps and identified them as familiar rather than threatening. 3 days of consistent care had transformed him from a traumatized refugee into something approaching a normal young donkey. Curious, affectionate, and displaying an intelligence that continued to surprise Cole. Looks like we're making people nervous, Cole said, showing Ash the note before folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. That's usually a good sign. He spent the morning working on ranch maintenance that had been neglected during Ash's settling-in period, but his attention kept drifting to the implications of direct threats. In his military experience, enemies who resorted to anonymous intimidation were usually operating from positions of weakness rather than strength. The question was how desperate they might become when intimidation failed. His phone buzzed with a call from Cedar Falls Town Hall, Mayor Patricia Hendricks. According to the caller ID, Cole had met her once during his initial move to the area, a conversation that had been brief and mutually polite, without any real warmth on either side. Mr. Danner, I hope you're well. Wondered if you might have time to stop by my office this afternoon. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you. What kind of matter? Oh, just some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Nothing urgent, but I think it would be better handled in person. Cole agreed to meet at 3 o'clock, already suspecting the nature of the concerns and their source. Small-town politics operated on relationships and obligations that were rarely documented, but always understood. Someone had called in a favor. Before driving to town, he made sure Ash was secure and called Doc Miller to let him know about the threatening note. The veterinarian listened without comment, then sighed with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many versions of the same story. "I was afraid this might happen," Doc said. "Cole, there are people in this county who've built their prosperity on arrangements that can't survive scrutiny. They're not going to give up easily. Neither am I. I know. That's what worries me." The drive to Cedar Falls took him through country that looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, rolling grassland interrupted by stands of pine and cottonwood, properties maintained with the kind of care that spoke to generational investment. It was easy to forget in this landscape that human nature carried shadows regardless of setting. Mayor Hendrick's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had served as the county courthouse until the 1960s. She was a woman in her late 50s who'd managed to project authority without losing approachability, the kind of political skill that won elections in communities where personal relationships mattered more than party affiliation. "Mr. Danner, thank you for coming." She gestured to a chair across from her desk, which was arranged with the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered in negotiations. "I'll get straight to the point. There have been some concerns raised about your involvement in the Peterson property incident." "What kind of concerns?" "Well, some folks feel that your, shall we say, enthusiasm for the situation might be creating unnecessary tensions in the community." Cole settled back in his chair with a kind of relaxed tension that often made people underestimate him. "Rescuing an abandoned animal creates tension." "Of course not. The rescue itself is admirable." Mayor Hendricks smiled with practiced political warmth. "It's more the questions you've been asking, the research you've been doing. Some people feel it might be better to let sleeping dogs lie, so to speak, even when those dogs might be covering up animal abuse." Her smile wavered slightly. "Mr. Danner, I understand you have a military background, and I'm sure that service instilled admirable values about duty and justice. But sometimes civilian situations require more flexibility than military ones." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that in a small community like ours, everyone has to get along. Everyone has to make compromises. The Peterson property fire was unfortunate, but it's over now, and continuing to investigate it serves no constructive purpose." Cole studied her face, reading the careful neutrality that suggested she was delivering someone else's message rather than expressing her own concerns. "Who asked you to have this conversation with me, Mayor?" "No one asked me to do anything. I'm simply trying to maintain community harmony by discouraging investigation of potential crimes." Mayor Hendrick's expression hardened slightly. "By suggesting that sometimes the greater good requires individuals to consider the broader impact of their actions." Cole stood up, the conversation having reached its natural conclusion. "I appreciate your concern, Mayor, but I'm keeping the donkey, and I'm going to continue asking questions until I get satisfactory answers. Mr. Danner, have a good afternoon." "Ma'am." After leaving the mayor's office, Cole drove to the Bluebird Cafe, seeking the kind of honest conversation that seemed increasingly rare in his interactions with local officials. Sarah Chen was behind the counter, serving coffee to a customer with the kind of attentive warmth that had made her establishment the unofficial heart of Cedar Falls' social life. She looked up when he entered, her smile carrying genuine pleasure rather than the careful neutrality he'd encountered at City Hall. "Cole, perfect timing. I just finished a fresh batch of apple pie, and I've been hoping for an excuse to try a piece." He settled into a corner booth that offered views of both the street and the cafe's interior, old habits activated by increasing awareness of potential threats. Sarah brought coffee and pie without being asked, and then slid into the seat across from him with her own cup. "You look like someone who's been having difficult conversations," she observed. "Mayor." Hendricks wanted to discuss community harmony. Sarah's Expression shifted to something that looked like resigned understanding. "Ah, someone's been applying pressure. Seems that way. How much do you know about Marcus Webb's business interests?" "More than I wish I did." Sarah's voice dropped to conversational tones that wouldn't carry to other tables. "He's been acquiring properties in this county for about 15 years, usually after unfortunate incidents that force owners to sell below market value." "What kind of unfortunate incidents?" "Fires, mostly. Sometimes equipment failures or sudden problems with water rights, or regulatory issues that appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly after ownership transfers." Cole absorbed this information while watching Sarah's face, noting the careful way she chose her words. "You're saying there's a pattern. I'm saying there have been coincidences that strain credibility. But proving patterns and proving criminality are different things entirely. What made you decide to stay in Cedar Falls?" "You could practice social work anywhere." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, Cole caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath her competent exterior. "Sometimes running away from problems just means they follow you to the next place. Sometimes you have to make a stand somewhere, even if it's not the place you originally planned to fight." After leaving the cafe, Cole spent an hour walking through Cedar Falls' small downtown, observing the rhythms of a community that appeared normal on the surface, but carried undercurrents of tension beneath its civility. People nodded politely when they recognized him, but conversations paused when he passed, resuming in quieter tones after he'd moved on. The kind of social dynamics that developed when everyone understood there were subjects that couldn't be discussed openly. On the drive home, Cole's phone rang with Doc Miller's number. "Cole, you should know. I've been doing some research of my own about animal welfare complaints in this county. Found some interesting patterns in the state database." "What kind of patterns?" "Complaints that were filed but never investigated, reports that disappeared from official records, inspections that were scheduled but never conducted, all involving properties that Marcus Webb later acquired through shell companies." "How many properties?" 7 over the past 12 years. Always the same sequence. Problems develop. Complaints are filed, complaints disappear. Mysterious incidents force sales. Webb acquires the land through intermediaries." Cole pulled over to the side of the road, needing to give this information his full attention. "Doc, that's racketeering." "Federal crime. It is if you can prove intent and coordination. But proving it requires evidence that hasn't been systematically destroyed or buried in bureaucratic procedures designed to discourage follow-through." Back at the ranch, Cole found Ash waiting in the barn with the kind of alert attention that suggested he'd been listening for the truck's return. The donkey had developed a routine of greeting Cole at the end of each day, a gesture that felt like homecoming in ways that surprised him. "We're stirring up a hornet's nest," Cole told him, while checking the security of the barn doors and windows. "And hope you're ready for things to get complicated." Ash approached and nuzzled Cole's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that had become their evening ritual. But tonight, Cole noticed the donkey's ears remained pricked forward, alert for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. As darkness settled over the ranch, Cole made his evening rounds with increased attention to details that might indicate surveillance or preparation for more direct action. The threatening note had escalated the situation from intimidation to explicit menace, which meant his adversaries were either becoming more desperate or more confident. Either possibility suggested that the next move would come soon, and it wouldn't be another polite conversation about community harmony. In the house, Cole placed the threatening note in a folder with other evidence he'd collected, then checked the locks on all doors and windows. Some preparations felt paranoid until they became necessary, and military experience had taught him that the time to prepare for violence was before it arrived at your doorstep. Outside, the Montana night settled over his ranch with deceptive peace, while somewhere in the darkness, people who preferred their business to remain private were deciding how far they were willing to go to protect their investments. Cole had made similar calculations in other places under different circumstances, and he understood that some lines, once crossed, changed everything that followed. The Cedar Falls Public Library occupied a Carnegie building from 1923. Its high windows and hardwood floors, carrying the dignified atmosphere of an era when libraries served as temples to public knowledge. Cole had avoided the place during his 8 years in the county, preferring the solitude of his ranch to the potential social interactions that library visits required. But Sarah's revelation about Webb's pattern of property acquisitions had stirred memories that demanded investigation. The head librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, was a woman in her 70s who'd spent 40 years collecting and preserving local history with the dedication of someone who understood that communities lost their souls when they forgot their stories. She greeted Cole with the professional warmth of someone accustomed to helping people find information they weren't entirely sure they wanted to discover. "Mr. Danner, isn't it? I remember when you moved to the area. How can I help you today?" "I'm looking for information about a fire that occurred in 1989, the Danner farm, out near Willow Creek." Mrs. Vasquez's expression shifted to something that looked like recognition, mixed with sympathy. "The Danner fire. You're related to the family." "It was my family's farm. I was 12 years old when it happened." She nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd helped other people research their own tragedies. "We have newspaper archives going back to the 1920s, plus some unofficial records that were donated by families over the years. Let me show you what we have." The microfilm reader occupied a corner of the research section, surrounded by boxes of archived materials that spoke to decades of careful preservation. Mrs. Vasquez loaded the appropriate film with practiced efficiency, then left Cole alone with his past. The headline from the September 15th, 1989 edition of the Cedar Falls Weekly appeared on the screen in stark black and white. "Tragic fire claims farm. 2 lives." Below it was a photograph that stopped Cole's breathing for several seconds. The image showed the burned remains of his childhood home, skeletal frame timbers reaching toward an ash-gray sky. In the foreground, barely visible, was the twisted metal of Tommy's bicycle, the 10-speed their parents had bought him for his 8th birthday. 3 months before the fire, Cole stared at the photograph until his eyes began to water, then forced himself to read the accompanying article. A devastating fire swept through the Danner farm early Tuesday morning, claiming the lives of Thomas Danner, 8, and his father, Robert Danner, 41. The blaze, which authorities believe started in the barn due to faulty electrical wiring, spread rapidly to the main house and other outbuildings. Robert Danner died attempting to rescue livestock from the burning barn. His son Thomas was found in his bedroom, apparently overcome by smoke before he could escape. Sarah Danner, 39, and her son Cole, 12, survived by jumping from a second-story window. Fire Chief William Patterson stated that the intensity of the blaze and its rapid spread made rescue attempts impossible. The State Fire Marshal's office will investigate the cause, though preliminary findings suggest electrical malfunction in the barn's aging wiring system. Cole printed the article and photograph, then searched for follow-up stories. What he found was revealing in its absence. No state fire marshal's report in subsequent editions, no insurance investigation findings, no updates on the official cause determination. The story had simply disappeared from public record after the initial coverage. He expanded his search to property records, tracing ownership of the Danner farm after the fire. The pattern was familiar from Doc Miller's research: insurance settlement that barely covered the mortgage, forced sale to a development company that existed for 6 months before transferring ownership to another shell corporation. The ultimate owner, revealed through a chain of paper corporations and holding companies, was Marcus Webb. Cole sat back in his chair, the full scope of Webb's operation beginning to crystallize. This wasn't opportunistic land acquisition or even organized crime in any traditional sense. This was systematic generational theft, targeting families during their most vulnerable moments, using tragedy as a business model. His family's farm had been one of the early acquisitions in Webb's empire, And Tommy's death had been an acceptable cost of doing business. Mrs. Vasquez appeared beside his chair, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. "I thought you might want to see these as well. Unofficial records that were donated by the Patterson family." Cole looked up, recognizing the name from the fire chief quoted in the newspaper article. "William Patterson kept personal files on cases that troubled him," she explained. "His widow donated them to the library after he passed away 5 years ago. The Danner fire was among the cases that apparently haunted him. Inside the folder were handwritten notes in the careful script of someone accustomed to official reporting, but these notes carried personal observations that would never appear in public records. Burn patterns inconsistent with electrical fire origin. Multiple ignition points suggest accelerant use. State fire marshal investigator never arrived, despite confirmed appointment. Insurance company accepted preliminary findings without independent verification. Property sale completed with unusual speed. Buyer had financing arranged before fire occurred." At the bottom of the final page, Chief Patterson had written a single line that made Cole's hands tremble. This was arson. Someone killed that boy and his father for their land. Cole photographed every page with his phone, then returned to the microfilm reader to search for other fires in the county during the same time period. The pattern emerged clearly across 3 decades. Suspicious fires that were never properly investigated. Families forced into distress sales. Properties that eventually ended up in Marcus Webb's expanding portfolio. 17 farms and ranches, acquired through tragedy and official indifference. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or join your family." Cole looked around the library, noting the positions of other patrons, the sightlines to windows, the potential escape routes that military training had taught him to catalogue automatically. Someone was watching him, tracking his research, escalating from anonymous notes to explicit death threats. He gathered his materials and approached Mrs. Vasquez at the reference desk. "Mrs. Vasquez, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that it might be dangerous information." She studied his face with the kind of attention that came from decades of reading people's needs and fears. "Go ahead, Mr. Danner. Has anyone else been researching similar information? Asking about fires, property transfers, anything related to Marcus Webb's business interests?" Her expression grew troubled. "There was someone about 3 years ago, a young woman from the state attorney general's office. She spent several days going through the same records you've been examining. What happened to her investigation?" "I don't know. She promised to return with additional questions, but I never saw her again. Her business card is still in my desk drawer if you'd like her contact information." Cole accepted the card. Assistant Attorney General Jennifer Walsh, Public Integrity Division, and made note of her phone number. Another thread to pull, another potential ally or cautionary tale. On the drive back to the ranch, Cole's awareness remained heightened, watching for vehicles that might be following, noting changes in the familiar landscape that could indicate surveillance or preparation for ambush. The anonymous threats had moved from intimidation to explicit menace, which meant his adversaries were either becoming desperate or confident enough to escalate toward violence. At home, he found Ash waiting in the barn with the alert posture that had become familiar, ears pricked forward, eyes bright with intelligence that seemed to recognize the change in Cole's emotional state. "Found out why they want us to stop asking questions," Cole told him, settling onto a hay bale with the printed photograph from the newspaper. "It's not about you specifically, little one. It's about a whole system of theft and murder that's been operating in this county for 30 years. Ash approached and sniffed the photograph, then looked at Cole with those dark eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond their species. The donkey had witnessed his own version of deliberate cruelty, and perhaps recognized the connection between their experiences. Cole's phone rang, Sarah Chen's number. "Cole, I heard you were at the library today. Mrs. Vasquez is worried about you." "Good reason to be worried. This goes deeper than I thought." "How deep?" 30 years deep. My brother was murdered, Sarah. My father too. For their land. Silence on the other end of the call, then Sarah's voice carrying a weight he hadn't heard before. "Come to the cafe tonight after closing. There are things I need to tell you, and people you need to meet." "What kind of people?" "The kind who've been waiting for someone like you to arrive. Someone with the skills to fight back." After ending the call, Cole spent the evening hours preparing for what felt like a transition from investigation to active resistance. He cleaned and checked his hunting rifles, tested the security system he'd installed when he first moved to the ranch, and made sure his emergency supplies were accessible and current. In his bedroom, he retrieved the wooden box containing his dog tags and held them while studying the newspaper photograph of his burned childhood home. Two artifacts from different periods of loss, connected by the same malignant force that had shaped both tragedies. Ash appeared in the bedroom doorway, having somehow opened his stall door, a development that spoke to intelligence and determination that continued to surprise Cole. "You're right," Cole said to the donkey, who was watching him with alert attention. "Time to stop running from the past and start making sure it doesn't repeat itself." Outside, the Montana night carried sounds that might have been wind through pine trees, or the whisper of enemies moving through darkness. Cole had learned long ago that paranoia and preparedness occupied the same territory, and that survival often depended on treating the difference as irrelevant. Tomorrow, he would meet Sarah's people and discover whether his fight against Webb's empire would be conducted alone or as part of something larger. Tonight, he would stand watch with a traumatized donkey and the ghost of a brother who'd been 8 years old when powerful men decided his life was worth less than the land beneath his. Veet, the Bluebird Cafe after closing time, felt different than during business hours. Quieter, more intimate, with the kind of atmosphere that suggested conversations that couldn't happen in public. Cole arrived at 9:30 to find Sarah waiting with 3 other people he recognized from around town, but had never actually met. "Cole, I'd like you to meet some friends," Sarah said, gesturing to the small group assembled around a corner table. "This is Jim Rodriguez, who used to own the feed store until it burned down in 2018. Maria Santos, whose family ranch was foreclosed after their cattle got mysteriously sick in 2019, and Dave Mitchell, former county building inspector, until he was forced to resign for asking too many questions about permit irregularities." Cole shook hands with each of them, recognizing the kind of careful assessment that people developed when they'd been forced to choose sides in conflicts they never wanted to join. "We've been meeting informally for about 2 years, Sarah explained. "Comparing notes, sharing information, trying to understand the scope of what's been happening in this county." Jim Rodriguez, a man in his 60s with work-hardened hands and gentle eyes, spread a collection of documents across the table. "These are copies of land purchase agreements, insurance settlements, and property transfers going back 15 years. All connected to Marcus Webb's business empire, all following the same pattern." Cole studied the documents with increasing amazement at their scope and coordination. Webb hadn't just been opportunistically acquiring distressed properties. He'd been systematically creating the distress that forced those sales. The feed store fire, the distress that forced those sales. "The feed store fire," Jim said, pointing to a thick folder, "started in the storage area where I kept industrial chemicals for farm supply sales. Fire department said it was accidental chemical ignition, but I'd been storing those same chemicals the same way for 23 years, without incident. Insurance settlement covered about 60% of replacement cost," Maria Santos added. "Jim couldn't rebuild, had to sell the property for 30 cents on the dollar. Webb acquired it through Rockmont Holdings 6 months later. Dave Mitchell, the former building inspector, pulled out another set of documents. These are the permit applications and inspection reports for properties that Webb later acquired. Notice the pattern. Routine inspections suddenly reveal major code violations that require immediate, costly remediation." Cole examined the inspection reports, noting dates, violation types, and the inspector signatures. "You were forced out for questioning these findings?" "For refusing to sign off on violations that didn't exist," Dave corrected. I've been doing building inspections for 30 years. I know what structural problems look like. And I know what manufactured problems look like. Sarah poured coffee for everyone, then settled back into her chair with the kind of expression that suggested she was about to reveal something significant. There's more, Cole. We've been trying to contact the State Attorney General's office about our findings. Jennifer Walsh, Cole said. I got her business card from the library today. She's been missing for 18 months, Maria said quietly. Officially, she took leave of absence for personal reasons and never returned. Unofficially, her apartment was cleaned, out overnight, and her car was found abandoned at Denver International Airport. Cole absorbed this information while studying the faces around the table, people who'd lost their livelihoods, their homes, their faith in official justice, but who'd continued meeting in secret to document crimes that no one seemed willing to prosecute. How many others are involved in this group? He asked. 12 active members, Sarah replied. Maybe 20 more who provide information but can't risk open participation. People are scared, Cole. Webb doesn't just destroy businesses, he destroys lives. Jim Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. My grandson was supposed to start college this fall. Had a partial scholarship, good grades, everything lined up. After the fire, after I lost the store, we couldn't cover the remaining tuition. He's working at a gas station now, watching his dreams disappear because someone wanted my property. Cole understood the true scope of Webb's operation now, not just criminal enterprise, but systematic community destruction that spread from victims to their families, their futures, their hope for something better than survival. What do you want from me? He asked. We want someone with the skills to fight back, Dave Mitchell said. Someone who understands tactics and strategy, who won't be intimidated by threats or corrupted by offers. Sarah told us about your military background, Maria added. Special forces, combat experience, the kind of training that teaches people how to win against superior numbers and resources. Cole looked around the table, reading the hope and desperation in their faces. They were asking him to become something he'd tried to leave behind. A weapon pointed at human targets, a solver of problems through applied violence. There might be another way, he said carefully. Legal channels, federal investigation, media attention. We've tried all of that, Sarah interrupted. Federal investigators get transferred or reassigned. Media stories disappear from publication schedules. Legal challenges get buried in procedural delays until plaintiffs run out of money. Jim Rodriguez pulled out a final document, a thick folder marked with Webb's corporate logo. This is what convinced us that conventional approaches won't work. Inside were detailed financial records, property maps, and what appeared to be operational plans for Webb's continuing expansion. Cole recognized the format from military intelligence briefings. Comprehensive strategic planning with contingencies for opposition and resistance. How did you get these? Cole asked. Someone inside Webb's organization has been feeding us information, Sarah explained. Someone who's finally gotten disgusted with what they've been part of. Cole studied the documents, noting the scope of Webb's future plans. 17 additional properties targeted for acquisition, detailed profiles of current owners, and timelines that suggested coordinated actions designed to force multiple simultaneous distressed sales. His ranch was on the list, along with Ash's rescue specifically mentioned as a complicating factor requiring resolution. They're planning something big, Cole realized. Not just individual property acquisitions, but a coordinated campaign to control most of the usable land in this county. Within 5 years, according to their projections, Dave confirmed. Webb wants to turn this entire area into a private kingdom where he controls agriculture, development, and commerce. Cole's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn cold. A photograph of Ash in his barn stall, taken from inside the barn, with a message that read, "Last warning." He showed the text to the group, watching their expressions shift from concern to something approaching fear. They were in my barn tonight, Cole said quietly. While I was here, Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. Cole, maybe you should consider relocating Ash somewhere safer. No. Cole's voice carried the kind of finality that ended discussions. Running away just validates their power and encourages escalation. Besides, Ash isn't the real issue anymore. He gestured to the documents spread across the table. This is about 17 families who are going to lose everything unless someone stops this pattern. This is about a community that's being systematically destroyed by criminals who've learned to use the legal system as a weapon. So, what do you propose? Maria asked. Cole was quiet for several seconds, his mind shifting into the tactical planning mode he'd used during military operations where conventional approaches had failed and unconventional methods became necessary. Webb's operation depends on official indifference and community fear, he said finally. It survives because people feel isolated and powerless against organized crime with institutional protection. Meaning? Meaning we change those conditions. We make it impossible for officials to look the other way. And we demonstrate that organized crime isn't invulnerable to organized resistance. Jim Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying Cole with new attention. You're talking about taking this beyond legal challenges. I'm talking about making the cost of continuing this operation higher than the profit it generates, Cole replied. I'm talking about turning Webb's tactical advantages into strategic vulnerabilities. After the meeting ended and Cole returned to his ranch, he found evidence of the evening's intrusion, barn doors that were closed but not latched the way he'd left them, subtle disturbances in Ash's stall that suggested someone had been handling the donkey, footprints in the soft earth outside the barn that were too large to be his own. Ash appeared agitated but unharmed, pressing close to Cole with the kind of desperate affection that animals displayed when they'd been frightened by strangers with bad intentions. They were here, weren't they? Cole murmured, checking the donkey for any signs of mistreatment. Probably trying to decide whether to hurt you or just threaten to hurt you. He spent the next hour conducting a thorough security sweep of his property, noting other signs of intrusion and surveillance. Professional work, but not quite professional enough. Whoever had been here possessed good fieldcraft, but not the excellent tradecraft that military special operations demanded. In his bedroom, Cole opened the wooden box containing his dog tags and held them while considering the transformation that seemed inevitable. For 8 years, he'd tried to build a life defined by healing rather than violence, by construction rather than destruction. But some enemies only understood force, and some situations couldn't be resolved through goodwill and patience. Sheriff Hawkins called at 11:30. His voice carrying the weariness of someone delivering a message he didn't want to give. Cole, I need to ask you to consider relocating that donkey you've been caring for. There have been complaints about noise ordinances and zoning violations. What complaints? From whom? Official complaints that require official responses. I'm trying to help you here, Cole. There are people who want this situation resolved quickly and quietly. Ray, are you telling me to surrender evidence of animal abuse to the people who committed it? A long pause. I'm telling you that sometimes the smart thing to do is avoid fights you can't win. After ending the call, Cole sat on his porch with Ash beside him, looking out over land that had become a battlefield, whether he'd wanted that or not. The donkey leaned against his leg with the trust of someone who'd learned that protection sometimes came from the most unlikely sources. Tomorrow, he would begin the kind of campaign he'd hoped never to fight again. But this time, the enemy wasn't foreign soldiers in distant countries. This time, it was domestic criminals who'd learned to hide behind legal systems and community fear. This time, it was personal in ways that made victory not just tactically necessary, but morally imperative. The storage unit in Cedar Falls had been rented under Cole's mother's name for 26 years. The monthly payments automatically deducted from an account she'd set up before her death. Cole had received notification of its existence only after settling her estate, but grief and geographical distance had prevented him from dealing with its contents until now. Unit 47B contained the salvaged remnants of a life interrupted. Furniture too damaged for use but too precious to discard. Photographs that had survived smoke and water damage. Boxes of documents that bureaucracy demanded but family rarely revisited. Cole had come searching for anything that might shed light on the fire that had shaped his entire existence, hoping that his mother's careful preservation instincts had captured evidence that official investigations had missed or ignored. Most of the boxes contained exactly what he'd expected: insurance paperwork, medical records, the careful documentation of a woman trying to rebuild after catastrophic loss. But in the back corner, beneath a water-stained tarp, Cole found a metal strongbox that he didn't recognize. The key was taped to the bottom, wrapped in plastic that had kept it functional despite decades of temperature fluctuations. Inside, beneath legal documents and family photographs, was a small notebook with Tommy's diary written on the cover in his mother's careful handwriting. Cole sat heavily on a nearby box, the diary trembling in his hands. His mother had never mentioned finding it, never suggested that Tommy had kept a diary, never hinted that any record existed of his brother's final thoughts and observations. The entries began 3 months before the fire, written in the careful block letters of an 8-year-old who was still learning to translate thoughts into written words. July 15th. Dad says we might have to sell the farm. Mom cried when she thought I wasn't looking. Cole doesn't know yet, but I heard them talking. Some man wants to buy our land, but Dad says we're not ready to sell. July 23rd. The man came to our house again. He's tall and has mean eyes, and he made Dad angry. After he left, Dad said some people think money can buy anything, but they're wrong. Mom said we should pray for guidance. Cole read through weeks of entries that painted a picture of his family under increasing pressure. Threats disguised as business offers, subtle intimidation that escalated over time. Tommy had been observant beyond his years, recording details that adults might have dismissed, but that formed a pattern when assembled chronologically. August 10th. Saw the mean man talking to other men behind the feed store. They didn't see me because I was hiding in the truck while Dad bought supplies. One of them had a gas can, and they were looking at papers that had drawings of our farm on them. August 18th. Someone has been coming to our property at night. Found footprints by the barn and tire tracks that aren't from our truck. Dad doesn't believe me, but I know what I saw. Cole thinks I'm making up stories, but I'm not. The entries continued through late August, documenting surveillance, veiled threats delivered through intermediaries, and attempts to sabotage equipment that would force costly repairs. Tommy had recorded it all with the meticulous attention of a child who understood that adults weren't taking his observations seriously. Then Cole reached the final entry, dated September 14th, 1989, the night before the fire. The mean man came back tonight with 2 other men. I was supposed to be asleep, but I snuck out to the hayloft and watched through the window. They poured something around the barn and the house. The mean man told the others to make sure it looked like an accident, and that everyone would be asleep when it started. One of them said, "What about the kids?" And the mean man said, "Accidents happen to whole families." I wanted to tell Dad, but they were still outside, and I was scared they would see me. I hid this diary in the barn wall where no one will find it. If something happens to us, maybe someone will find it someday and know the truth. The mean man's name is Marcus Webb. I heard him say it to the others. Marcus Webb is going to hurt our family. Cole stared at the final entry until the words blurred, his hands shaking as the full weight of revelation settled over him. Tommy had known, had witnessed the preparation for arson and murder, had tried to preserve evidence in the only way an 8-year-old could think to do. And then he died before dawn, along with their father, while Cole and their mother escaped only because Tommy's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, where smoke accumulated first, buying them the extra minutes needed to jump from windows. Cole's phone rang, jarring him from memories that suddenly carried different meaning. Sarah Chen's number appeared on the screen. "Cole, where are you? You were supposed to meet me at the cafe an hour ago." He'd forgotten their appointment entirely, lost in the devastating realization that his family's murder hadn't been random tragedy, but targeted assassination designed to acquire land for Marcus Webb's expanding empire. I found something. Sarah, evidence that changes everything. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves Webb murdered my family 30 years ago. The kind that makes this personal in ways I never imagined. Silence on the other end of the call, then Sarah's voice carrying new urgency. Cole, where are you right now? Storage unit on Pine Street? Going through my mother's things. Get out of there now. Come to the cafe. But watch your back if you found evidence. They might be watching to see if you found evidence. Cole gathered Tommy's diary and the other contents of the strongbox, securing them in a waterproof bag before loading his truck. The drive to the Bluebird Cafe required constant attention to his mirrors, watching for vehicles that might be following, noting changes in traffic patterns that could indicate surveillance or interception attempts. At the cafe, Sarah waited with Jim Rodriguez and Dave Mitchell, their expressions reflecting the kind of alertness that came from understanding that situations had escalated beyond planning and preparation. "Show us," Sarah said simply. Cole placed Tommy's diary on the table and read the final entry aloud, watching their faces register the same shock and outrage that had overwhelmed him. When he finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. "Jesus," Dave Mitchell finally whispered. "Your 8-year-old brother witnessed them planning the arson and died before he could tell anyone," Jim added. "But he left evidence. Actual eyewitness testimony, even if the witness is gone." Sarah picked up the diary with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Cole, this changes the entire scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't just ongoing criminal enterprise. This is evidence of multiple murders spanning 3 decades. It's also evidence that my entire adult life has been shaped by running from something I never understood." Cole realized. The reason I joined the military, the reason I can't sleep, the reason I ended up isolated on a ranch in Montana, all of it traces back to trauma. From my family's murder. He looked around the table at faces that reflected understanding of how personal trauma intersected with community corruption. Each of them had lost something to Webb's systematic criminality, but Cole's losses went back to childhood, to the original blueprint that had shaped all subsequent operations. "There's something else," Cole continued, pulling out his phone to show them the photograph of Ash in his barn. "They were inside my property last night. Close enough to photograph Ash while I was here meeting with you." "Security breach," Dave said immediately. "They're escalating from surveillance to direct action." Sarah's expression hardened with the kind of resolve that came from reaching a decision point where retreat was no longer possible. "We need to accelerate our timeline. Whatever we're going to do, it has to happen before they decide that eliminating Cole is easier than continuing to intimidate him." Cole studied the faces around the table, people who'd been ground down by years of systematic oppression, who'd watched their community be systematically destroyed, who'd finally found someone willing to fight back, using methods that went beyond legal challenges and official procedures. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "Are you prepared for this to become a war? Because that's what it is. A war between people who believe in community and people who believe in exploitation. And wars have casualties." Jim Rodriguez leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Cole, my grandson is working at a gas station instead of going to college because these bastards burned down my store. Maria's family lost their ranch because Webb poisoned their cattle. Dave lost his career because he wouldn't sign off on fraudulent inspections. We've been fighting a war for years," Maria added. "We just haven't been fighting it effectively because we didn't have someone with the skills to win." Cole felt the familiar weight of command settling over him, the responsibility for other people's lives, the necessity of making decisions that would determine who survived and who didn't. It was a burden he'd carried in Afghanistan and Iraq, in places where the enemy was clearly defined and the rules of engagement were established by military law. This time, The enemy was domestic, and the rules were whatever kept innocent people alive, while ensuring that justice finally reached people who'd thought themselves above accountability. "All right," Cole said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd accepted command in hostile territory. "But we do this right. Professional planning, careful execution, minimal risk to civilians. And we document everything, because when this is over, there needs to be evidence that justice was served rather than revenge taken." Sarah smiled with grim satisfaction. "What's the first step?" Cole looked down at Tommy's diary, at his brother's final words, preserved in a child's careful handwriting. The plan that had been forming in his mind since discovering Sarah's resistance group suddenly crystallized into operational clarity. First, we disappear, all of us. Make it look like we gave up and left town, while actually establishing a secure base of operations where we can plan and prepare without surveillance. And then we turn Marcus Webb's systematic approach against him. Every technique he's used to destroy families and acquire property, we use to destroy his empire and acquire evidence of his crimes. Cole closed the diary and looked around the table at the faces of people who'd chosen to trust him with their hopes for justice and their acceptance of the risks that justice sometimes required. "He's had 30 years to perfect his system," Cole continued. "But systems have vulnerabilities, especially when they're built on assumptions that no one will fight back effectively." Outside the Bluebird Cafe, Cedar Falls continued its normal evening routines. People finishing dinner, children playing in yards, the ordinary activities of a community that appeared peaceful on the surface. But beneath that surface, Cole could feel the current of change that occurred when long-suppressed conflicts finally reached the point where violence became not just possible, but inevitable. Marcus Webb had created this situation through 3 decades of systematic criminality, disguised as business success. Now he would learn what happened when someone with Cole's skills and Tommy's evidence decided that accountability was long overdue. The war for Cedar Falls was about to begin, and this time the right side had a commander who understood how to win. The abandoned Hendricks Ranch, 12 miles north of Cedar Falls in terrain too rough for profitable agriculture, provided exactly what Cole needed for operational planning: isolation, defensible positions, and sightlines that would reveal approaching vehicles long before they became threats. The property had been empty since old Ben Hendricks died 5 years earlier, his children having moved to cities and careers that didn't include Montana ranch maintenance. Cole arrived before dawn, his truck loaded with supplies and equipment that ranged from military surplus gear to sophisticated electronics that would have been impossible to acquire 20 years earlier. The digital revolution had democratized surveillance and intelligence gathering in ways that military strategists were still learning to exploit. Sarah and the other resistance members arrived in separate vehicles over the next 2 hours, each taking circuitous routes that avoided main roads and obvious surveillance points. They gathered in the ranch's main barn, a structure solid enough to muffle voices while providing escape routes in multiple directions. Cole had spent the night converting the barn's interior into a tactical operations center, complete with topographical maps, satellite imagery printed from online sources, and a communication setup that would allow secure contact with external resources. Tommy's diary occupied a place of honor on the central table, open to the final entry that had transformed their mission from community activism to pursuit of justice for multiple murders. "Before we begin," Cole said, addressing the group that had grown to include 2 new members, a retired county clerk named Patricia Wells, who had access to historical records, and Miguel Santos, Maria's nephew, who worked as an IT specialist for the county government. "I need everyone to understand what we're committing to. This operation will cross legal lines. It will expose all of us to criminal prosecution if we're caught. And it will make us permanent enemies of people who've already demonstrated willingness to kill." He paused, studying faces that reflected both fear and determination in equal measure. Anyone who wants to leave can do so now, with no judgment and no questions asked. No one moved. All right, then. Cole pulled out a notebook filled with tactical sketches and operational timelines. We have 3 primary objectives. Gather irrefutable evidence of Webb's criminal enterprise. Neutralize his ability to retaliate against witnesses or victims. And ensure that evidence reaches federal authorities who can't be corrupted or intimidated. Dave Mitchell leaned forward to study the maps. How do we accomplish all that without getting killed? By doing what Webb has never faced before. Coordinated resistance that uses his own methods against him. Cole traced routes on the topographical map with a red pen. Webb's operation depends on isolation, intimidation, and information control. We're going to systematically destroy all 3 advantages. He opened the notebook to reveal detailed tactical plans, sketched with military precision, property layouts, security assessments, equipment requirements, and contingency plans for various scenarios, ranging from surveillance detection to armed confrontation. Miguel, you're our intelligence specialist. I need detailed information about Webb's current operations, financial records, property holdings, personnel files, communication patterns, anything that reveals structure, vulnerabilities, and planned activities. Miguel Santos nodded, his expression reflecting the kind of focused intensity that came from finally being able to use professional skills for personal justice. I can access county databases without leaving digital footprints. Federal systems are more challenging, but I have contacts who owe me favors. Patricia, you're our historical analyst. I need every documented connection between Webb and suspicious incidents over the past 30 years. Insurance claims, property transfers, regulatory violations, anything that establishes pattern and intent. Patricia. Wells smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose decades of meticulous record-keeping were finally going to serve a purpose beyond bureaucratic compliance. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask the right questions about Marcus Webb's business practices. Cole turned to Jim Rodriguez and Maria Santos. You two coordinate community intelligence. I need to know Webb's current security measures, daily routines, personnel locations, and any changes in operational patterns that might indicate he's preparing for escalation. What about the rest of us? Sarah asked. Sarah, you're my deputy commander and liaison with external resources. If something happens to me, you take over operations and ensure the evidence gets to people who can act on it. Cole pulled out his cell phone and showed them a contact number he'd programmed that morning. Agent Jennifer Martinez, FBI Public Integrity Section, Denver office. She's investigating political corruption in Western states and has authority to pursue federal charges. She's also the replacement for Jennifer Walsh, the agent who disappeared while investigating Webb's operation. The implication hung in the air. Without needing explanation, they were dealing with people who'd already eliminated federal investigators who got too close to the truth. And timeline is 48 hours, Cole continued. We gather intelligence today and tonight, execute evidence collection tomorrow, and initiate contact with federal authorities tomorrow evening. After that, either we've succeeded or we're all in immediate danger. He closed the notebook and looked around the barn at people who'd been transformed from isolated victims into members of an operational unit. Questions? What about Ash? Sarah asked. Webb's people have already demonstrated they'll target him to get to you. Cole had been considering that exact problem throughout the night. Balancing operational security against personal responsibility to an animal who'd become both symbol and catalyst for everything that followed. Ash comes with us. He's evidence of Webb's criminal enterprise, and he's safer under our direct protection than hidden somewhere Webb's people might find him. As if summoned by his name, Ash appeared in the barn doorway. Cole had brought him from the ranch that morning, and the donkey had spent the first hour exploring his new environment with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested intelligence bordering on tactical awareness. Now, Ash approached the group with alert confidence, his dark eyes scanning faces with the kind of assessment that animals developed when they'd learned to distinguish between humans who could be trusted and those who represented danger. "He knows," Maria observed. "Look at him. He understands something important is happening." Cole reached out to stroke Ash's neck, feeling the solid warmth of an ally who'd been through his own version of hell and chosen to trust again. Smart animals recognize when their people are preparing for conflict. Military working dogs do the same thing. Over the next 6 hours, the team dispersed to their assigned tasks while Cole remained at the ranch with Ash, using secure communications to coordinate intelligence gathering and monitor Webb's responses to their apparent disappearance from normal routines. Miguel's initial reports confirmed what Cole had suspected. Webb's organization was larger and more sophisticated than even their research had revealed. Shell companies, offshore accounts, political connections that reached state and federal levels, and security personnel with military and law enforcement backgrounds. He's got at least 12 people on his payroll who carry guns professionally, Miguel reported during a secure call. Some of them are retired sheriff's deputies, some are ex-military contractors, and at least 2 have federal law enforcement backgrounds. Any current law enforcement connections? Sheriff Hawkins is completely compromised. His department's budget has been supplemented by Webb's community safety donations for the past 8 years. Also, the county prosecutor's office has been receiving similar donations. And the judge who handles most civil cases owns property that Webb manages through intermediaries. Cole absorbed this information while watching Ash graze peacefully in the meadow outside the barn. Complete corruption of local authority meant that any mistakes would result in immediate retaliation rather than legal protection, Patricia Wells called with historical intelligence that painted an even darker picture. 17 suspicious fires over 30 years, 43 families displaced, 12 people who died in accidents after opposing Webb's business practices. "Your family wasn't the first, Cole," she said quietly. "They were just the first that got properly documented by someone who was there to witness it." As evening approached, Cole finalized operational plans that balanced maximum intelligence gathering with minimum risk exposure. The key was speed and coordination, hitting multiple targets simultaneously so that Webb security couldn't respond effectively to all threats at once. Sarah returned from her reconnaissance mission with photographs of Webb's compound, a fortified ranch complex that looked more like a military installation than a civilian residence, complete with security cameras, motion sensors, and armed guards who patrolled the perimeter in scheduled rotations. Professional setup, Cole assessed, studying the photos with the trained eye of someone who'd assaulted similar facilities under hostile conditions. But they're set up to defend against random intrusion, not coordinated intelligence collection. Dave Mitchell arrived with technical equipment he'd acquired through connections in the construction industry. Listening devices, camera systems, and electronic tools that could penetrate security measures designed to stop casual surveillance. As darkness settled over the abandoned ranch, Cole gathered his team for final operational briefing. They assembled around the tactical maps with the focused intensity of people who understood that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice was served or whether they became additional casualties in Webb's 30-year war against their community. "Tomorrow morning, we begin the most dangerous phase," Cole announced. "We're going to penetrate Webb's security, collect evidence of his crimes, and force a confrontation that will either expose his entire operation or get us killed trying." Ash wandered over to stand beside Cole, the donkey's presence providing unexpected reassurance to everyone present. Here was physical proof that rescue was possible, that victims could survive and recover, that sometimes the most unlikely alliances produce the strongest bonds. "Any final questions before we commit to this course of action?" Cole asked. Jim Rodriguez raised his hand. "What happens if we succeed? If we actually bring down Webb's empire and expose 30 years of murder and theft?" Cole considered the question while looking around at faces that reflected hope mixed with realistic awareness of the risks they were accepting. "If we succeed," he said finally, "we give back to this community what Webb stole from it, the belief that justice is possible, that ordinary people can fight back against corruption, and that some things are worth risking everything to protect." He gestured toward Ash, who was watching them with the kind of intelligent attention that suggested understanding beyond his species. "That little donkey taught me something important over the past week," Cole continued. "Sometimes salvation comes to us in forms we don't expect, from sources we never anticipated. But it only works if we're brave enough to accept help when it's offered, and strong enough to offer help when it's needed." Outside the barn, Montana Knight settled over terrain that had witnessed a century of human struggles for survival, prosperity, and dignity. Tomorrow, that terrain would witness one more chapter in the endless conflict between people who built communities and people who exploited them. But this time, the community had a defender who understood both the cost of violence and the higher cost of allowing evil to flourish unchallenged. This time, Marcus Webb would face an enemy who possessed the skills, the evidence, and the moral certainty necessary to end his reign over Cedar Falls. The war was about to begin, and Cole Danner intended to win it. The confrontation came at dawn, exactly as Cole had planned. Webb's compound sat quiet in the morning light, its security systems functioning normally while recording the approach of what appeared to be a routine delivery truck. Miguel's intelligence had identified the blind spots in the surveillance network, and Dave Mitchell's construction industry contacts had provided legitimate cover for accessing the property. Cole drove the delivery truck with professional casualness, his military bearing concealed beneath work clothes and a clipboard that suggested mundane business rather than tactical operation. In the passenger seat, Ash sat with alert attention, his presence serving multiple purposes: emotional support, evidence of Webb's crimes, and bait for the trap that was about to spring. The compound's main gate opened automatically when Cole presented forged delivery credentials that Miguel had created using his access to county contractor databases. Security cameras tracked their progress up the winding drive, but the guards who monitored them saw nothing more threatening than a routine service call. Marcus Webb emerged from his house as Cole parked near the main entrance, his expression reflecting the kind of casual arrogance that came from 30 years of facing challenges that money and intimidation had always resolved. He was dressed for another day of managing his empire, unaware that the empire was about to collapse around him. "You're trespassing, Danner," Webb called out as Cole climbed from the truck. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it's over." "No games," Cole replied, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd used during military operations, where emotional control meant the difference between success and catastrophe. "Just time for some honest conversation about what happened to my family." Webb's eyes narrowed as he registered Ash in the truck cab, then shifted to assess Cole's positioning and potential weapons. Professional paranoia activated by the recognition that this wasn't a random encounter. "Your family died in an accident 30 years ago. Tragic, but not my concern." Cole pulled out Tommy's diary, holding it where Webb could see the childish handwriting on the cover. "My 8-year-old brother left something behind. A detailed account of you and your men planning their murder." For the first time since Cole had known him, Webb's composure cracked slightly, his eyes fixed on the diary with the kind of recognition that came from seeing evidence he'd thought was destroyed decades ago. "That proves nothing. Fantasies of a disturbed child. Tommy recorded everything," Cole continued, opening the diary to the final entry. "Your name, your men, your plan to make it look like an accident, all documented the night before you killed." Him. Webb's hand moved toward the concealed weapon Cole had spotted during their previous encounters. Subtle shift that spoke to training and experience with violence as problem-solving. "Tool, I wouldn't," Cole said quietly. "You're surrounded by people who've been waiting 30 years for this conversation. And everything you say is being recorded by equipment your security system can't detect. The micro recorder concealed in Cole's workshirt was military-grade electronics that Miguel had acquired through channels that didn't require official authorization. Every word of Webb's responses was being transmitted to recording devices hidden throughout the compound, creating multiple backup copies of evidence that couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of menace that had intimidated dozens of families into submission. "This county runs on arrangements that existed before you arrived and will continue after you're gone. Arrangements that include murdering children. Arrangements that maintain order and prosperity for people smart enough to cooperate." Cole felt the familiar tactical awareness that preceded action in hostile territory, heightened perception, emotional distance, and the kind of clarity that came from accepting that violence was now inevitable. Like the Peterson livestock operation? Like the 17 families you've destroyed? Like the federal investigator who disappeared after asking too many questions? Webb's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine surprise. "How much do you know?" "Everything. Financial records, operational plans, personnel files, political connections. 30 years of systematic murder and theft, all documented and ready for federal prosecution." The sound of approaching vehicles reached them from the compound's entrance. Multiple engines, coordinated arrival, the kind of tactical movement that spoke to law enforcement rather than civilian traffic. Webb's head snapped toward the sound, his composure finally collapsing as he realized that the conversation wasn't negotiation, but confession being recorded for official use. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, reaching for his weapon with the desperation of someone who'd finally encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through intimidation or corruption. Cole was faster, military reflexes activated by recognition of lethal intent. He closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, disarming Webb with techniques that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions in training that emphasized efficiency over drama. The weapon clattered across concrete, while Webb stumbled backward, his face reflecting the shock of someone who'd spent decades avoiding physical confrontation and had forgotten how quickly such confrontations could be decided by superior training and preparation. "Federal agents," Cole called toward the approaching vehicles, his voice carrying across the compound with parade ground authority. "Suspect is disarmed and secured." The confession recording had captured everything: Webb's acknowledgement of the arrangements, his implied admission of involvement in Jennifer Walsh's disappearance, his attempt to draw a weapon on Cole, and most importantly, his failure to deny any of the specific accusations about systematic murder and land theft. As FBI vehicles surrounded the compound and agents deployed with the coordinated precision of people who'd spent weeks planning this operation, Cole looked back toward the delivery truck where Ash waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that human conflicts eventually resolved themselves one way or another. The donkey's presence had been crucial to the operation's success, not as evidence or symbol, but as the catalyst that had forced Webb to reveal his true nature under pressure. An abandoned animals rescue had exposed a 30-year criminal enterprise and brought justice to families who'd thought justice was impossible. "Mr. Danner," called Agent Martinez as she approached with handcuffs for Webb. "Thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. The evidence your team provided has been invaluable." Cole nodded, feeling the weight of command and responsibility finally lifting from his shoulders. The mission was complete, the enemy was neutralized, and his brother's murder would finally receive the justice it deserved. But as he walked back toward Ash, Cole realized that the real victory wasn't Webb's arrest or the exposure of his criminal empire. The real victory was the discovery that healing was possible, that communities could fight back against corruption, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the strongest bonds. She looked up as Cole approached, his dark eyes reflecting trust and affection that had grown from shared trauma into something approaching family. They'd saved each other, Cole realized. The donkey by providing purpose and connection, Cole by providing protection and justice. The war for Cedar Falls was over. But the peace that followed would be built on foundations that neither Webb nor his predecessors had understood. The simple truth that some bonds transcended species, and some commitments were worth whatever price they demanded. The federal investigation warrant that Agent Martinez produced was 23 pages long and represented 6 months of coordinated investigation by agencies ranging from the FBI's Public Integrity Section to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Montana. Cole recognized the thoroughness that spoke to bureaucratic determination to ensure that no procedural errors would compromise the prosecution of crimes that spanned 3 decades. Marcus Webb, you are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit arson, multiple counts of murder, witness tampering, and federal civil rights violations, Agent Martinez announced, while her partner secured handcuffs with professional efficiency. Around the compound, additional FBI agents emerged from vehicles that continued arriving in coordinated waves. This wasn't a simple arrest. It was the systematic dismantling of a criminal enterprise that required simultaneous action at multiple locations to prevent evidence destruction and witness intimidation. Cole watched the operation unfold with the tactical appreciation of someone who'd participated in similar missions under military command. Every movement was coordinated, every agent knew their specific role, and backup plans were clearly in place for various contingencies. Webb's security personnel offered no resistance, apparently recognizing the futility of opposing federal law enforcement agencies that had arrived with overwhelming force and legal authority. Several of them actually appeared relieved, as if they'd been waiting for someone to end their participation in activities that had grown progressively more disturbing over time. The warrant covers all properties owned by Webb or his associated companies, Agent Martinez explained to Cole as evidence teams began their methodical search of the compound. We're executing simultaneous raids on 17 locations throughout the county. From his position near the delivery truck, Cole could see the scope of the federal response through radio communications that crackled with reports from other teams. Sheriff Hawkins' office was being searched, Mayor Hendricks was being questioned, and county officials who'd accepted Webb's donations were discovering that their financial arrangements were now evidence in federal criminal proceedings. The corruption network that had seemed invulnerable just hours earlier was collapsing with remarkable speed once federal resources were applied. Systematically, Agent Martinez, Cole said, there are people in this community who've been fighting Webb's operation for years. They deserve to see that justice is finally being served. She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd worked similar cases involving systemic corruption and community intimidation. We'll need their testimony for prosecution, and they'll need protection during the legal proceedings. But yes, after 30 years, they deserve to witness accountability. Cole's phone buzzed with messages from Sarah and other team members, reporting successful completion of their assigned roles in the operation. The community network that Webb had tried to destroy through isolation and fear was now coordinating the exposure of his crimes with the same systematic approach he'd used to commit them. An hour later, as evidence teams continued their methodical documentation of Webb's compound, Sheriff Hawkins arrived alone in his patrol car. Cole watched him approach with interest, noting the careful way he moved and the expression that suggested someone preparing to make a difficult decision. Cole, Hawkins said, his voice carrying weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. I need to tell you something that should have been said years ago. Go ahead, Ray. I knew. Maybe not all the details, maybe not the full scope, but I knew Webb's operation was dirty and I looked the other way because it was easier than fighting. A battle I thought I couldn't win. Hawkins removed his sheriff's badge and held it in his hands like something that had become too heavy to carry. I'm resigning effective immediately. Agent Martinez has the county commissioner's authorization to assume law enforcement authority until replacement elections can be held. Cole studied the sheriff's face, reading genuine remorse mixed with the relief that came from finally abandoning a position that had become morally untenable. Ray, sometimes the system forces decent people to make impossible choices. The important thing is recognizing when it's time to make better ones. Your family deserved better than they got from this county's law enforcement. Your brother deserved someone who would investigate his murder instead of accepting convenient lies. Hawkins extended his hand, and Cole shook it with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd found the courage to acknowledge their mistakes and attempt redemption. As afternoon turned to evening, the community response to Webb's arrest spread throughout Cedar Falls, with the kind of organic momentum that develops when long-suppressed truth finally reaches daylight. People who'd been isolated by fear and intimidation began gathering in public spaces, sharing stories that had been whispered privately for years. The Bluebird Cafe became unofficial headquarters for celebration and planning, with Sarah coordinating efforts to support families who'd been victimized by Webb's operation. Doc Miller arrived with veterinary supplies for animals that had been rescued from Webb's properties, his expression reflecting satisfaction that went beyond professional success. Found 17 animals in various stages of neglect and abuse, he reported. Nothing that can't be healed with proper care and time. Cole returned to the abandoned ranch where their tactical operation had been planned, bringing Ash back to territory that had served as sanctuary during the most dangerous phase of their mission. The donkey seemed to understand that the immediate threat had passed, his posture more relaxed than it had been since Cole first discovered him behind the barn. As evening settled over Montana landscape that had witnessed the end of Webb's 30-year reign, Cole sat on the ranch house steps with Ash beside him, both of them watching stars emerge in clear sky that seemed to reflect the clarity that came from achieving justice after decades of systematic injustice. His phone rang. Agent Martinez. Cole, preliminary examination of Webb's records confirms everything your team documented and more. Financial evidence of bribes, personnel files showing hired intimidation, communication records proving coordination of arson and murder. This is going to be one of the largest public corruption prosecutions in Montana history. What about the families he victimized? Federal victim compensation funds will provide restitution, and civil asset forfeiture will return much of the stolen property to original owners or their heirs. It won't undo the damage, but it's the beginning of making things right. After ending the call, Cole remained on the steps with Ash, contemplating the transformation that had begun with rescuing an abandoned donkey and culminated in dismantling a criminal empire. The personal had become political, the local had become federal, and individual trauma had become community healing. Ash leaned against his leg with the trust that had developed between them, two survivors who'd found in each other the courage to face dangerous truth rather than comfortable lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal system processed decades of accumulated evidence, and the community began rebuilding institutions that had been corrupted by Webb's influence. But tonight belonged to the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally possible, and that some bonds transcended species, while some commitments were worth whatever price they demanded. 6 months after Marcus Webb's arrest, Cole stood beside the foundation stone of what would become the Thomas Danner Memorial Animal Sanctuary, watching construction crews pour concrete that would support buildings designed to house animals recovering from trauma and abuse. The stone itself bore simple engraving, Thomas Danner, 1981 to 1989. His courage revealed the truth that set us free. The Federal Victim Compensation Fund had provided resources beyond what Cole had imagined possible. Webb seized assets, combined with grants from animal welfare organizations and donations from people who'd followed the story through national media coverage, had transformed Cole's modest ranch into a facility capable of caring for dozens of animals while providing educational programs about trauma recovery and community resilience. Ash stood nearby, no longer the terrified creature Cole had discovered behind his barn, but a confident leader among the sanctuary's growing population. The donkey had assumed responsibility for helping new arrivals adapt to safety, a role that seemed to fulfill some deep need to transform his own suffering into healing for others. He knows what they've been through, Sarah observed, settling beside Cole on the wooden bench they'd placed near the construction site. Her presence had become as natural as breathing over the past months, their partnership deepening from shared mission into something approaching family. They watched Ash approach a recently rescued horse whose ribs showed evidence of prolonged neglect, offering the kind of patient companionship that animals understood better than human sympathy. The horse's tension gradually decreased. Under Ash's gentle attention, process Cole had witnessed dozens of times as traumatized, animals learned to trust again. Doc Miller thinks we'll have capacity for 50 animals by spring, Sarah continued. The county commissioners approved the zoning changes unanimously, and the new sheriff's department has offered to provide security during the transition period. The new sheriff was Maria Santos, elected in a special election that had drawn unprecedented voter participation from people who discovered their voices during Webb's exposure and prosecution. Her first official act had been establishing an animal welfare enforcement unit, staffed by officers trained to recognize signs of systematic abuse. Cole's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Webb sentenced to life without parole. Co-conspirators received 25 years. Justice served. He showed the message to Sarah, who smiled with satisfaction that didn't require words. The legal proceedings had lasted 4 months, with testimony from 17 families whose lives had been destroyed by Webb's systematic criminality. Cole had testified about his brother's murder, reading portions of Tommy's diary to a courtroom that listened in absolute silence. The defense attorneys had offered no credible challenges to evidence that documented 30 years of coordinated crime spanning multiple federal jurisdictions. During the sentencing phase, Webb had finally shown emotion, not remorse for his victims, but rage at being held accountable by people he'd considered beneath his notice. The judge had responded with words that Cole carried like ammunition. "Mr. Webb, your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the social contract that allows communities to exist. Your sentence reflects society's determination that such betrayal will not be tolerated." "Cole," Sarah said, pulling him from memories of courtroom proceedings, "there's something I want to show you." She led him to the main barn, where construction crews had installed a display case containing artifacts from their investigation, Tommy's diary, photographs from the burned livestock facility, documentation of Webb's criminal enterprise, and letters from families whose properties had been returned through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. But the centerpiece was something Cole hadn't expected, a bronze plaque donated by the people of Cedar Falls, engraved with words that captured the story's larger meaning, in memory of all victims of systematic injustice and in honor of those who refuse to accept that power makes right. Their courage reminds us that communities survive not through the dominance of the strong, but through the protection of the vulnerable. Cole read the plaque twice, his throat tightening with emotions that had taken months to fully process. The personal trauma that had driven him toward isolation had been transformed into community healing that would continue long after he was gone. Dr. Miller appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a medical bag that had become familiar to every animal on the sanctuary. At 74, he'd expanded his practice rather than considering retirement, driven by the satisfaction of healing creatures that society had previously ignored. "Ash is asking for you," Doc announced with the kind of smile that suggested good news. "Think he wants to show you something." Outside, Cole found Ash standing beside a paddock where 3 recently rescued donkeys were settling into their new environment. The newest arrival, a young female found abandoned after her owner's arrest on animal cruelty charges, was allowing Ash to groom her neck, the first sign of trust she'd displayed since arriving. He's teaching her that safety is possible, Cole realized, watching the interaction with wonder that hadn't diminished despite months of similar observations. Sarah slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the easy intimacy of people who'd shared danger and emerged stronger rather than damaged. You taught him that first. Now he's passing it on. As evening settled over the sanctuary, Cole made his usual rounds to ensure all animals were secure and comfortable. The routine had evolved from necessity into meditation, a daily practice that connected him to purpose, that transformed pain into protection for others who'd suffered similar losses. In the distance, Cedar Falls showed lights that spoke to community rebuilding itself, around principles of transparency and genuine care rather than the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. New businesses were opening, young families were staying instead of fleeing to distant cities, and town meetings drew participation from people who'd learned that democracy required active engagement rather than passive hope. The war for Cedar Falls had been won not through violence, though violence had been necessary, but through the simple truth that some bonds transcended individual interest, while some commitments demanded whatever sacrifice they required. Cole looked up at Montana sky that stretched endlessly above land that had witnessed a century of human struggles for survival, prosperity, and dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as traumatized animals continued arriving and community healing continued evolving. But tonight belonged to the satisfaction of knowing that justice was not only possible, but sustainable when good people chose courage over comfort. Ash approached through the gathering darkness, his presence providing the same comfort that had sustained Cole through months of dangerous investigation and difficult testimony. They stood together in companionable silence. 2 survivors who discovered that salvation often came in forms nobody expected, from sources nobody anticipated, but that it only worked when people were brave enough to accept help when offered, and strong enough to offer help when needed. The bonds that saved them had become the foundation that would save others, ensuring that Thomas Danner's